The Civil War had just ended, and the war-torn nation needed to rebuild. The most pressing issue was how to best readmit the secessionist states to the Union. The Congress, as well as the nation, was deeply divided about how the reconstructed South should be governed, and how the individual rights of newly freed slaves would be protected. Democrats adamantly believed in states' rights and did not want the federal government to interfere in the reconstructed South. Republicans passionately supported a strong role for the federal government that would be responsible for protecting individual rights. What emerged from this political struggle was a period of radical Republican control over Reconstruction, defined by the actions of Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens and his supporters sought to establish and preserve the individual rights of African Americans through federal legislation, constitutional reform, and military occupation of the South. After 1876, these reforms were abandoned, and the Jim Crow South emerged. However, the legacy of Thaddeus Stevens' actions can be seen in the constitutional foundations of the modern civil rights movement. Historian Eric Foner describes, the driving force of radical ideology was the utopian vision of a nation whose citizens enjoyed equality of civil and political rights secured by a powerful and beneficent national state. Anticipating the end of the Civil War and preparing to build a slave-free society in the South, Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment into law, federally outlawing slavery and involuntary servitude in 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau was created shortly after, with the intent of protecting African Americans with social programs such as education. Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865 ended this moderate Reconstruction plan. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, was a former slave owner and a Southern Democrat. It became apparent that President Johnson would support states' rights and the formation of state governments with former Confederate leaders. Northerners who had fought in the Civil War to disband these governments were outraged. Johnson's refusal to compromise infuriated members of Congress, and radical Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania emerged as a prominent politician when he led Congress in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Stevens personally charged Johnson with attempting to bring Congress into disgrace. Although Johnson was ultimately acquitted by one vote, his influence and power was diminished. With Johnson powerless and the backing of a majority in Congress, Thaddeus Stevens led the radical Republicans' agenda. At this point, historian Foster Rhea Dulles describes Stevens as having a measure of control over Congress that for a time made him the most powerful man in the political life of the nation. Congress, led by Stevens, quickly acted to pass a series of bills to bring equality to African Americans living in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau extended the Bureau's operations another year. However, Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would have given African Americans full citizenship, claiming it would operate against the white race. A combination of Johnson's obstruction and Stevens' persuasive actions caused the moderate Republicans to support the radical agenda. Stevens believed that for an individual's rights to be sustainable, they must include citizenship, suffrage, and land ownership rights, protected by the federal government. Stevens thought that the best way to ensure these rights was through a constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment was drafted to preserve individual citizenship rights, but getting support for the amendment required Stevens to give up protections for land ownership, despite his belief that if we do not furnish them with homesteads and hedge them around with protective laws, we had better have left them in bondage. It was ratified July 9, 1868, 2 years after it was passed in Congress.
But at that time, he laid down a foundation for American civil rights because of his leadership and his sense of timing and his ability to be able to legislate.
Section 1 of the 14th Amendment declares that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Although the final amendment did not fulfill all of Stevens' goals, it did provide federal protection of individual rights by limiting the power of state government.
Stevens' insistence on the 14th Amendment is really the keystone for the whole building of the right of black citizenship in the United States. Without it, the whole thing tumbles.
Thaddeus Stevens' actions and leadership established a foundation for an egalitarian society and other gains in individual rights which were not limited to his lifetime. The ratification of the 15th Amendment 3 years after his death gave voting rights to African American males. The ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments established federal protection for individual rights of African Americans in the South, but enforcement of these measures still required action by federal troops. With national citizenship, equal protection under the law, and voting rights, as well as support from the federal army, African Americans enjoyed a political awakening of sorts in the late 1860s and mid-1870s. During this time, African Americans were able to elect representatives on a state and national level. In 1868, less than 1 year after Stevens' death, Republican John Willis Menard became the first African American elected to Congress. In 1870, Republican Hiram Revels was elected as the first African American senator. African American success was short-lived, however, as racist Southern Democrats were eager to regain control. As Stevens had feared, African Americans' lack of economic independence and land left them defenseless. When President Hayes removed Union troops from the South in 1876, Reconstruction ended and the South relapsed into segregation. The reconstituted states, led by Southern Democrats, stripped African Americans of individual rights through black codes and Jim Crow laws. Nearly 100 years after the collapse of Reconstruction, the modern-day civil rights movement rose from its ashes and fought yet again for the federal protection of individual rights, supporting Stevens' vision. During the 1950s, key Supreme Court cases such as Brown versus the Board of Education used the 14th Amendment to strike down segregationist policies. In 1957, President Eisenhower used federal troops to force the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. In the 1960s, civil rights groups pushed the nation's leadership to revisit the idea of federal protection of individual rights. Congress passed sweeping reforms such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which were then enforced by the executive branch. With these acts, Stevens' ideal of individual rights secured by a powerful federal government was ultimately realized in the 21st century. The legacy of the 14th Amendment is not limited to the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
It is alive today in the struggles that we see politically in the country for a lot of different people. And so it does have relevance for our lives today. So there are a number of ways in which the 14th Amendment continues to be a living, breathing part of our constitutional heritage.
In the 2003 Supreme Court ruling of Lawrence versus Texas, Justice Kennedy said that the writers of the 14th Amendment knew times can blind us to certain truths, and later generations can see that laws once thought necessary and proper, in fact, serve only to oppress. As the Constitution endures, persons in every generation can invoke its principles in their own search for greater freedom. Beyond race, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has also secured individual rights by outlawing discrimination in areas such as housing, disability, and gender. Thaddeus Stevens' actions in passing the 14th Amendment and insisting on federal protection of these rights laid the foundation for future advances in equal rights that continue to serve as his legacy. The life work of Thaddeus Stevens can best be summed up by his epitaph, "Equality of man before his Creator."